Question 1. To address the challenge of ensuring a renter client fully understands their insurance needs and the appropriate policy to meet those needs, which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional ethics for an HO4, Contents Broad Form Renters policy? Option A. Provide a quote for an HO4 policy without detailing its specific coverages or limitations, assuming the client will read the policy documents. Option B. Recommend an HO3 policy, assuming the client might eventually own a property and that this policy offers broader coverage. Option C. Clearly explain that an HO4 policy is designed for renters and covers their personal property and liability, but not the dwelling structure itself, and then tailor recommendations based on their specific inventory and risk assessment. Option D. Advise the client that their landlord's insurance will cover their personal belongings and any liability they may incur. The correct answer is C. Clearly explain that an HO4 policy is designed for renters and covers their personal property and liability, but not the dwelling structure itself, and then tailor recommendations based on their specific inventory and risk assessment. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an insurance specialist to accurately assess and advise a client on the appropriate coverage for their specific living situation, which is often misunderstood by renters. The HO4 policy is designed for individuals who rent their dwelling, providing coverage for personal property and liability, but not the dwelling itself. Misunderstanding this distinction can lead to underinsurance or purchasing an inappropriate policy, creating financial risk for the client and potential E&O claims for the specialist. Careful judgment is required to ensure the client's needs are met within the scope of available products and regulatory guidelines. The correct approach involves clearly explaining the nature of an HO4 policy, emphasizing that it covers the renter's personal belongings and liability, not the physical structure of the rented property. This aligns with the regulatory framework by ensuring the client receives accurate information about the product's limitations and benefits, enabling an informed decision. This approach upholds the duty of care and promotes transparency, which are fundamental ethical and regulatory expectations for insurance professionals. An incorrect approach would be to recommend an HO3 policy, dwelling policy, without a thorough understanding of the client's status as a renter. This is a regulatory failure because it misrepresents the product's suitability and could lead to the client paying for coverage they do not need or, conversely, not having the necessary coverage for their personal property. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to act in the client's best interest. Another incorrect approach would be to simply provide a quote for an HO4 policy without explaining its specific coverages and exclusions. This is a regulatory failure as it does not fulfill the obligation to educate the client about the policy's scope, potentially leading to a misunderstanding of their coverage. Ethically, this passive approach fails to ensure the client makes an informed choice, potentially leaving them inadequately protected. A third incorrect approach would be to assume the client's needs are covered by their landlord's insurance. While landlord insurance covers the structure, it does not extend to the renter's personal possessions or liability. Recommending this without clarification is a regulatory and ethical failure, as it provides incomplete and potentially misleading advice, leaving the client exposed to significant financial loss. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes client education and accurate product matching. This involves actively listening to the client's situation, clearly defining their needs and risks, and then explaining the available policy options, including their specific coverages, limitations, and suitability. This process ensures compliance with regulatory requirements for disclosure and advice, while also fulfilling ethical obligation to act in the client's best interest. Question 2. Analysis of a scenario where a homeowner's guest tripped and sustained injuries after the homeowner, in a moment of playful exuberance, lightly nudged the guest's arm as they were walking down a hallway. The homeowner had no intent to cause harm, but the guest lost their balance and fell. The homeowner's insurance policy includes coverage F medical payments to others. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework for homeowners insurance specialists when determining coverage for the guest's medical expenses? Option A. Deny the claim under coverage F because the insured's action, however light, directly contributed to the guest's injury, thereby constituting an excluded cause of loss. Option B. Approve the claim under coverage F as it is designed to cover medical expenses for others injured on the insured's premises, regardless of fault, and the homeowner's action was not intentionally malicious. Option C. Investigate the claim by reviewing the specific wording of coverage F, including definitions of occurrence and any exclusions for intentional acts or acts by the insured that cause injury, to determine if the homeowner's action falls within the policy's intent for this coverage. Option D. Consult with other insurance specialists to gauge common practice for similar incidents before making a coverage decision, as there may be an unwritten industry standard for such situations. The correct answer is B. Approve the claim under coverage F as it is designed to cover medical expenses for others injured on the insured's premises, regardless of fault, and the homeowner's action was not intentionally malicious. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the specialist to interpret the scope of coverage F medical payments to others, a coverage often misunderstood due to its broad applicability and potential exclusions. The challenge lies in distinguishing between a covered incident and one that falls outside the policy's intent, particularly when the insured's actions are involved, even if unintentional. Careful judgment is required to ensure accurate application of policy terms and adherence to regulatory principles of fair claims handling. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the policy's coverage F wording, specifically looking for definitions of occurrence and any exclusions related to intentional acts or acts committed by the insured that cause injury. Regulatory frameworks for homeowners insurance typically mandate that medical payments coverage is designed to address injuries sustained by others on the insured's premises, regardless of fault, but it is not intended to cover injuries the insured intentionally inflicts or causes through gross negligence that borders on intentionality. The specialist must determine if the guest's injury, while unfortunate, was a direct result of the insured's action that falls within the policy's intent for this coverage. If the insured's action, though not malicious, was a direct and foreseeable cause of the injury that goes beyond mere negligence, it may fall outside the scope of coverage F. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that immediately approves the claim without scrutinizing the insured's role in the guest's injury fails to uphold the policy contract and regulatory requirements for proper claims investigation. This approach risks paying for claims that are not intended to be covered under coverage F, potentially leading to increased premiums for all policyholders, and violating the principle of paying only for covered losses, an approach that automatically denies the claim solely because the insured was involved in the incident, without a detailed analysis of the nature of the insured's involvement and whether it constitutes an exclusion, is also professionally unsound. This can lead to a denial of a legitimate claim, causing financial hardship to the claimant and potentially violating regulations that prohibit unfair claim denial practices. The insured's involvement must be assessed against specific policy exclusions and the intent of coverage F. An approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or past, unrelated claim experiences, rather than the specific policy language and applicable regulations, is a failure of professional due diligence. This can lead to inconsistent and unfair claim handling, undermining the integrity of the insurance process and potentially violating regulatory mandates for consistent and equitable treatment of policyholders and claimants. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a systematic review of the policy contract, relevant statutes, and departmental regulations. This involves 1. Clearly identifying the coverage in question, coverage F, and its stated purpose. 2. Ascertaining the facts of the incident, paying close attention to the actions of the insured and the injured party. 3. Cross-referencing the facts against the specific terms, conditions, and exclusions of the policy, particularly those pertaining to coverage F and intentional acts. 4. Consulting applicable state insurance regulations and case law that interpret similar coverage provisions. 5. Documenting the entire decision-making process, including the rationale for approval or denial, to ensure transparency and compliance. Question 3. The investigation demonstrates that a homeowner has experienced significant water damage to their roof and is requesting immediate disbursement of claim funds to a contractor who proposes to use a portion of those funds to also address unrelated cosmetic issues in the living room. The homeowner's insurance specialist must determine the appropriate course of action. Option A. Advise the homeowner that claim proceeds are strictly for covered damages as outlined in the policy, and that any repairs beyond the scope of the water damage claim, including cosmetic improvements, must be funded separately by the homeowner. Option B. Authorize the immediate release of the full claim amount to the contractor, trusting the homeowner's assurance that the contractor will handle all necessary repairs, including the cosmetic work. Option C. Inform the homeowner that the claim funds can only be used for emergency repairs, and that the contractor must complete all work before any funds are released. Option D. Suggest to the homeowner that they can use a portion of the claim funds for the cosmetic living room repairs, as it is a minor addition to the overall repair project. The correct answer is A. Advise the homeowner that claim proceeds are strictly for covered damages as outlined in the policy, and that any repairs beyond the scope of the water damage claim, including cosmetic improvements, must be funded separately by the homeowner. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the homeowner's insurance specialist to balance the insured's desire for immediate repairs with the insurer's obligation to ensure claims are handled according to policy terms and regulatory requirements. The specialist must avoid making assumptions about the permitted use of funds and instead rely on established procedures and policy language. Careful judgment is required to prevent potential fraud, policy violations, or financial loss for either party. The correct approach involves verifying the specific policy provisions and relevant state regulations regarding the use of claim proceeds for repairs. This ensures that the funds are disbursed in a manner consistent with the contract and legal mandates, protecting both the insured and the insurer from misapplication of funds. This aligns with the regulatory framework that mandates insurers to act in good faith and adhere to policy terms, and for specialists to possess a thorough understanding of these terms and applicable laws. An incorrect approach of immediately authorizing the release of funds based solely on the insured's verbal assurance fails to uphold the insurer's duty to investigate and verify the claim's validity and the proposed use of funds. This could lead to a violation of policy conditions if the repairs are not covered or if the funds are used for unauthorized purposes, potentially constituting a breach of contract and regulatory noncompliance. Another incorrect approach of suggesting the insured use funds for unrelated expenses, even if temporarily, directly contravenes the principle that claim proceeds are intended to indemnify for specific covered losses. This action could be construed as facilitating or condoning the misuse of insurance funds, which is a serious ethical and regulatory violation, potentially leading to accusations of aiding and abetting fraud or misrepresentation. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of the claim details, cross-referencing with the specific policy language, and consulting internal guidelines or legal counsel if ambiguity exists. Specialists must prioritize adherence to regulatory requirements and policy terms, ensuring transparency and proper documentation throughout the claims process. This structured approach mitigates risk and upholds the integrity of the insurance transaction. Question 4. During the evaluation of a homeowner's insurance claim following a severe hailstorm, the insured expresses frustration and states, "This storm caused significant damage to my roof and siding. I expect my insurance to cover all of it, and I need it fixed immediately." The homeowner's insurance specialist is reviewing the initial claim report, which indicates potential damage, but also notes several policy exclusions related to wear and tear and pre-existing conditions. Which of the following approaches best reflects the specialist's professional and regulatory obligations in this initial interaction? Option A. Assure the insured that the policy will cover all the damage reported, as hailstorms are a covered peril, and immediately authorize emergency repairs to begin. Option B. Inform the insured that while the claim is being investigated, the policy does have exclusions for wear and tear and pre-existing conditions, and that the final coverage determination will depend on the findings of the adjuster's inspection and any supporting documentation. Outline the next steps in the claims process, including scheduling an inspection and requesting any necessary proof of loss. Option C. Advise the insured that based on the initial report, it is unlikely the claim will be covered due to the mentioned exclusions, and suggest they explore other options for repair. Option D. Explain that while the storm is a covered event, the specialist cannot provide any information about coverage until the adjuster has completed their investigation, and the insured will be contacted only when a decision has been made. Correct answer is B. Inform the insured that while the claim is being investigated, the policy does have exclusions for wear and tear and pre-existing conditions, and that the final coverage determination will depend on the findings of the adjuster's inspection and any supporting documentation. Outline the next steps in the claims process, including scheduling an inspection and requesting any necessary proof of loss. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the specialist to balance the insured's immediate need for clarity and assistance with the insurer's obligation to adhere to policy terms and regulatory requirements. The specialist must act as a conduit of accurate information while also managing expectations and ensuring that any advice given aligns with the policy contract and applicable laws. The core principle at play is the duty of utmost good faith, which binds both the insurer and the insured. The correct approach involves clearly and accurately communicating the policy's coverage limitations and exclusions to the insured, while simultaneously outlining the steps the insurer will take to investigate the claim. This upholds the principle of utmost good faith by being transparent with the insured about their coverage and the claims process. It also aligns with regulatory expectations for fair claims handling, ensuring the insured is not misled and understands the basis for any coverage decisions. Providing information about potential next steps, such as the need for further documentation or the possibility of a partial denial, is also crucial for managing expectations and demonstrating a commitment to a fair and thorough investigation. An incorrect approach would be to provide a definitive statement of coverage before a full investigation is complete. This violates the principle of utmost good faith by potentially misleading the insured into believing they have coverage that may not exist, leading to disappointment and potential disputes. It also bypasses the necessary claims investigation process, which is a regulatory requirement for fair claims handling. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the insured's concerns outright without a proper investigation or explanation. This demonstrates a lack of empathy and fails to uphold the duty of care owed to the insured. It can lead to a breach of regulatory guidelines concerning customer service and fair treatment of policyholders. A third incorrect approach would be to promise coverage that is clearly excluded by the policy terms, even if done with good intentions to appease the insured. This is a direct misrepresentation of the policy contract and a breach of the specialist's professional and ethical obligations. It can lead to significant financial repercussions for the insurer and damage the reputation of the specialist and the company. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Actively listening to the insured's concerns to understand the full scope of the situation. 2. Reviewing the policy contract thoroughly to identify relevant coverage provisions, exclusions, and conditions. 3. Consulting internal guidelines and regulatory requirements for claims handling. 4. Communicating clearly and empathetically with the insured, explaining the policy terms and the claims process without making premature coverage decisions. 5. Documenting all communications and actions taken. Question 5. Governance review demonstrates that a homeowner's insurance specialist is handling a claim for a total loss to a dwelling due to a fire. The policy includes replacement cost coverage for the dwelling. The property is 20 years old, and the specialist is considering applying depreciation to the cost of rebuilding the structure, arguing that the original materials would have depreciated over time. Which valuation method should the specialist apply for the dwelling coverage and why? Option A. Apply actual cash value, as the age of the property indicates significant depreciation of the original building materials, and this method better reflects the market value of the property prior to the loss. Option B. Apply replacement cost, as the policy contractually obligates the insurer to pay the cost to repair or replace the damaged dwelling with materials of like kind and quality, without deduction for depreciation, unless specifically excluded or limited by the policy. Option C. Apply replacement cost, but deduct depreciation for all structural components and finishes, as this is a standard industry practice for older homes to ensure fairness to the insurer. Option D. Apply actual cash value, as the policyholder will receive a new dwelling, and it is equitable to account for the betterment received by the policyholder. The correct answer is B. Apply replacement cost, as the policy contractually obligates the insurer to pay the cost to repair or replace the damaged dwelling with materials of like kind and quality, without deduction for depreciation, unless specifically excluded or limited by the policy. Explanation. This scenario presents a common challenge in homeowners insurance, accurately determining the appropriate valuation method for a claim. The professional challenge lies in balancing the policyholder's expectation of full restoration with the insurer's obligation to adhere to policy terms and regulatory requirements, particularly when market conditions or property age create discrepancies between replacement cost and actual cash value. Careful judgment is required to ensure fairness, compliance, and customer satisfaction. The correct approach involves applying the valuation method stipulated in the policy, which is typically replacement cost for the dwelling coverage, unless the policy specifically limits it to actual cash value or outlines depreciation. Replacement cost coverage aims to restore the insured property to its pre-loss condition with materials of like kind and quality, without deduction for depreciation. This aligns with the fundamental principle of indemnity, ensuring the policyholder is made whole. Regulatory frameworks for homeowners insurance generally support replacement cost as the standard for dwelling coverage, as it provides the most comprehensive protection for the homeowner's primary asset. Ethical practice dictates transparency and adherence to the policy contract, which is paramount in maintaining trust. An incorrect approach would be to automatically apply actual cash value to the dwelling, without a clear policy provision or justification. Actual cash value, ACV, is calculated as replacement cost minus depreciation. Applying ACV without the policy's consent or a valid reason would likely violate the principle of indemnity and potentially breach the insurance contract. This could lead to regulatory scrutiny for unfair claims settlement practices. Another incorrect approach would be to unilaterally decide to depreciate materials that are not typically subject to depreciation under replacement cost policies, such as new construction or recently installed components, without a clear contractual basis. This misapplication of depreciation would also constitute a failure to indemnify and could be viewed as an attempt to unfairly reduce the claim payout, leading to regulatory penalties. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough review of the specific policy language governing valuation. This includes understanding the definitions of replacement cost and actual cash value as provided in the policy. Next, assess the nature of the damage and the age and condition of the property to determine if depreciation is applicable under the policy terms. Consult internal claims guidelines and relevant state insurance regulations to ensure compliance. If there is ambiguity or a potential dispute, engage in open communication with the policyholder to explain the valuation method and its implications. Document all decisions and justifications meticulously. Question 6. System analysis indicates that a homeowner has an attached two-car garage that is directly accessible from the main living area of their house. The homeowner is seeking clarification on whether the value of this attached garage is included under coverage a dwelling on their homeowner's insurance policy. Based on standard homeowners insurance policy language and common industry practice, what is the most appropriate determination regarding coverage for this attached garage? Option A. The attached garage should be assigned a separate specific coverage limit distinct from coverage A. Option B. The attached garage should be treated as another structure and covered under the 10% limit typically allocated for detached outbuildings. Option C. The attached garage is considered part of the dwelling and is included under coverage a dwelling. Option D. The attached garage should be excluded from coverage a dwelling as it is primarily used for vehicle storage. The correct answer is C. The attached garage is considered part of the dwelling and is included under coverage a dwelling. Explanation. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge for a homeowner's insurance specialist when dealing with coverage a dwelling. The challenge lies in accurately interpreting and applying the policy's definition of dwelling to a structure that is not the primary residence but is attached to it and serves a functional purpose. Professional must balance the policy's intent, the insured's reasonable expectations, and the specific wording of the contract to ensure correct coverage is applied. Misinterpreting this can lead to underinsurance or overinsurance, impacting both the insured and the insurer. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the policy's definition of coverage, a dwelling, specifically looking for clauses that address attached structures or structures used for residential purposes. In many standard homeowners policies, an attached garage is considered part of the dwelling. The policy language typically defines the dwelling as the house, other structures and additions attached to the dwelling. An attached garage by its nature is an addition attached to the dwelling and is integral to its use. Therefore, it is generally included under coverage A. This aligns with the principle of indemnity ensuring the insured is compensated for the loss of the covered property. An incorrect approach would be to exclude the attached garage from coverage solely because it is primarily used for vehicle storage. This fails to recognize that the policy's definition of dwelling often encompasses all attached structures, regardless of their primary function, as long as they are structurally connected to the main residence. This approach ignores the explicit wording of the policy and the common understanding of what constitutes the dwelling in a residential context. Another incorrect approach would be to automatically assign a separate coverage limit to the attached garage without consulting the policy. This deviates from the standard policy structure, where attached structures are typically included under the main dwelling coverage. It could lead to unnecessary complexity and potentially incorrect premium calculations. A third incorrect approach would be to assume the attached garage is considered an other structure and therefore subject to a separate, typically lower coverage limit, often 10% of coverage A. While some detached structures might fall under other structures, an attached garage is almost universally considered part of the dwelling itself due to its physical connection and integration with the main house. This misclassification would result in inadequate coverage for the garage. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a systematic process. 1. Understand the insured situation. Clarify the nature of the structure in question and its relationship to the primary dwelling. 2. Consult the policy contract. Carefully read the definitions of dwelling, other structures, and any specific exclusions or inclusions related to attached structures. 3. Apply policy wording. Interpret the policy language in its most reasonable and common-sense application, considering industry standards. 4. Seek clarification if necessary. If policy language is ambiguous, consult underwriting guidelines or senior colleagues. 5. Communicate clearly. Explain the coverage determination to the insured with reference to the policy. Question 7. Comparative studies suggest that the effectiveness of a homeowner's insurance policy is significantly influenced by the accuracy and clarity of its foundational documents. When reviewing a new homeowner's insurance policy for a client, which approach to the declarations page best ensures regulatory compliance and upholds ethical obligations to the policyholder? Option A. Confirming that the premium calculation aligns with the quoted rate and that the policy is issued promptly. Option B. Relying on the applicant's provided information as inherently accurate and proceeding with policy issuance without further verification of the declarations page details. Option C. Verifying that all details on the declarations page, including property description, coverage limits, deductibles, and named insureds, precisely match the underwriting information and application, ensuring it accurately reflects the agreed-upon coverage. Option D. Prioritizing the completion of administrative tasks associated with policy issuance over a detailed examination of the declarations page content. The correct answer is A. Confirming that the premium calculation aligns with the quoted rate and that the policy is issued promptly. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because the accuracy and completeness of the declarations page are fundamental to the validity and enforceability of a homeowner's insurance policy. Misinterpreting or misrepresenting information on this page can lead to significant coverage gaps, disputes, and potential regulatory noncompliance. Careful judgment is required to ensure all parties understand their obligations and entitlements as clearly defined by the policy's core terms. The correct approach involves meticulously reviewing the declarations page to confirm that all listed items, such as property details, coverage limits, deductibles, and named insureds, accurately reflect the agreement between the insurer and the policyholder. This ensures that the policy document precisely mirrors the risk being insured and the terms of coverage. This aligns with regulatory requirements that policies be clear, accurate, and not misleading, providing policyholders with a transparent understanding of their insurance contract. Ethically, it upholds the principle of good faith and fair dealing by ensuring the policy accurately represents the coverage purchased. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the premium amount without verifying the underlying details on the declarations page fails to ensure the accuracy of the policy's core terms. This can lead to a policy that does not provide the intended coverage, potentially leaving the policyholder underinsured or with unexpected exclusions, which is a violation of fair practices and potentially misleading to the consumer. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of issuance over thorough review of the declarations page risks overlooking critical errors or omissions. This haste can result in a policy that is technically invalid or does not accurately reflect the risk, leading to future claim disputes and regulatory scrutiny for issuing inaccurate policies. A further incorrect approach that assumes the information provided by the applicant is always correct without independent verification or cross-referencing with other policy documents or underwriting guidelines can lead to the acceptance of inaccurate data. This can result in a declarations page that misrepresents the insured property or risk, violating the insurer's duty to accurately underwrite and price the policy, and potentially misleading the policyholder about their coverage. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that emphasizes accuracy, clarity, and compliance. This involves a systematic review of the declarations page, cross-referencing information with underwriting guidelines and application details, and ensuring all terms are clearly understood by both the insurer and the policyholder. When in doubt, seeking clarification from underwriting or management is paramount to upholding professional standards and regulatory obligations. Question 8. System analysis indicates that a homeowner is seeking to insure their newly purchased property and requests the highest available dwelling coverage limit, stating they believe this amount is necessary to rebuild the home. The insurance specialist has access to the property's appraisal and initial inspection report, which suggests the requested coverage limit may exceed the insurer's standard underwriting guidelines for similar properties. Specialist needs to determine the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance and client satisfaction. Option A. Refuse to offer any dwelling coverage until a full and detailed architectural review of the property is completed to definitively confirm the rebuild cost. Option B. Bind coverage for a dwelling amount that is within the insurer's standard guidelines but lower than the insured's request, without fully explaining the rationale for the reduction to the insured. Option C. Immediately bind the policy for the highest requested dwelling coverage limit to meet the insured's immediate needs, assuming the appraisal value is sufficient justification. Option D. Advise the insured on the available dwelling coverage options based on the insurer's guidelines, clearly explaining the implications of each option, and that binding coverage is subject to the insurer's final underwriting approval. The correct answer is D. Advise the insured on the available dwelling coverage options based on the insurer's guidelines, clearly explaining the implications of each option, and that binding coverage is subject to the insurer's final underwriting approval. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an insurance specialist to balance the insured's desire for immediate coverage with the insurer's need for accurate risk assessment and adherence to underwriting guidelines. The specialist must act as a fiduciary, ensuring the policy accurately reflects the risk and that the insured understands the terms, while also facilitating a smooth and compliant transaction. Careful judgment is required to avoid misrepresenting coverage or binding a policy that the insurer may later decline or modify significantly, potentially leading to coverage disputes and regulatory scrutiny. The correct approach involves advising the insured on the available dwelling coverage options based on the information provided, explaining the implications of each, and clearly stating that binding coverage is contingent upon the insurer's final underwriting approval. This approach upholds regulatory requirements by ensuring transparency, accurate representation of policy terms, and adherence to the insurer's underwriting authority. It prioritizes informed consent and avoids premature commitment, thereby protecting both the insured and the insurer. An incorrect approach would be to immediately bind the policy for the highest requested dwelling coverage without confirming it aligns with the insurer's underwriting guidelines or without clearly communicating the conditional nature of the coverage. This failure constitutes a misrepresentation of coverage and a potential violation of underwriting authority. It exposes the insured to the risk of a claim being denied or the policy being rescinded if the insurer later discovers the risk is unacceptable or the information provided was inaccurate. Ethically, it breaches the duty of good faith and fair dealing by creating a false sense of security. Another incorrect approach would be to refuse to offer any dwelling coverage until all potential underwriting issues are resolved, even if the insured needs immediate protection. While caution is important, an overly restrictive stance can be seen as a failure to adequately serve the client's needs within the bounds of acceptable risk. Specialists should explore options for temporary or conditional coverage if available and appropriate, rather than outright denial without exploring alternatives. This can lead to client dissatisfaction and potential complaints. A third incorrect approach would be to bind coverage for a lower dwelling amount than requested without a clear explanation to the insured, implying that the higher amount is unavailable due to underwriting restrictions that are not fully articulated. This lack of transparency can lead to misunderstandings about the extent of protection and may result in the insured being underinsured, which is a failure to meet their stated needs and expectations. The professional decision-making process should involve a thorough understanding of the insurer's underwriting appetite and guidelines, clear communication with the insured about coverage options and limitations, and a commitment to transparency throughout the application and binding process. Specialists should always seek to inform and educate the client, ensuring they make an informed decision based on accurate information and a clear understanding of the policy's terms and conditions, while always operating within the insurer's delegated authority. Question 9. Investigation of a homeowner's insurance claim reveals a dispute regarding the scope of coverage for water damage. The insured believes the damage is covered under the sudden and accidental discharge provision, while the insurer points to an exclusion related to seepage and gradual leakage. The policy jacket contains the standard insuring agreements and exclusions, and a specific endorsement modifies the definition of water damage for this policy, which approach best aligns with regulatory compliance and sound insurance practice for determining coverage. Option A. Focus on the most recent claims handling practices for similar water damage scenarios, as this indicates current insurer interpretation. Option B. Rely on the insured's recollection of the agent's verbal explanation of coverage during the sales process, as this reflects their understanding of the policy. Option C. Prioritize the specific wording of the endorsement that modifies the definition of water damage. Then interpret the insuring agreement and exclusions in light of that modification, ensuring consistency with state insurance regulations. Option D. Apply general industry standards for water damage claims, as these are commonly understood and applied across the market. Correct answer is C. Prioritize the specific wording of the endorsement that modifies the definition of water damage, then interpret the insuring agreement and exclusions in light of that modification, ensuring consistency with state insurance regulations. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an insurance specialist to navigate the complex interplay between policy language, regulatory requirements, and the insured's understanding of their coverage. Misinterpreting or misapplying policy structure can lead to significant financial and legal repercussions for both the insurer and the policyholder. Careful judgment is required to ensure that policy provisions are applied consistently and in accordance with established legal and regulatory frameworks. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the homeowner's insurance policy structure, specifically the relationship between the declarations page, the policy jacket, including conditions and exclusions, and any endorsements. This approach prioritizes adherence to the specific language of the policy and relevant state insurance regulations, ensuring that coverage is determined based on the contractual agreement and legal mandates. Regulatory justification stems from the principle that insurance contracts are legally binding documents, and their interpretation must align with the statutes and administrative rules governing insurance in the relevant jurisdiction. This ensures fair treatment of the policyholder and upholds the integrity of the insurance market. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the insured's perceived intent, without referencing the explicit policy language and endorsements, fails to uphold the contractual obligations. This can lead to coverage disputes and potential regulatory violations for failing to adhere to the written contract. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes industry custom or general market practices over the specific policy terms and conditions is also problematic. While industry norms can inform interpretation, they cannot override the explicit terms of a contract or regulatory requirements. This can result in inconsistent application of coverage and potential unfairness to policyholders. A third incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or past claims handling without a systematic review of the policy and applicable regulations risks creating inconsistent and potentially discriminatory claim outcomes, which is a direct violation of regulatory principles of fairness and equity. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive review of the policy documents, including the declarations page, insuring agreements, conditions, exclusions, and all endorsements. This review should be cross-referenced with the applicable state insurance statutes and regulations. When ambiguities arise, the principle of asterisk contra pro frontum asterisk, interpreting ambiguous language against the drafter, may be considered, but only after exhausting all avenues of clear contractual and regulatory interpretation. The ultimate goal is to arrive at a coverage determination that is both contractually sound and legally compliant, ensuring transparency and fairness for the policyholder. Question 10. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing enhanced roof bracing in high-wind areas significantly reduces the likelihood of catastrophic roof damage, a common and costly claim. As a homeowner's insurance specialist operating under the specified regulatory framework, which approach to advising policyholders on this loss prevention measure is most compliant and professionally sound. Option A suggests that policyholders consult with a general contractor for a broad assessment of their home's structural integrity, without specifically detailing the benefits or requirements of roof bracing. Option B recommend enhanced roof bracing, providing clear, actionable guidance on the types of bracing that meet industry standards and regulatory expectations for wind resistance, and explaining how this measure contributes to overall risk reduction and potential long-term policy benefits. Option C advise policyholders to upgrade their roofs to a more expensive, premium material that offers superior wind resistance, as this is a more comprehensive solution, regardless of the cost-effectiveness of bracing alone. Option D focus solely on the cost savings for the insurer by reducing potential claims, without detailing the specific technical requirements or benefits of roof bracing to the policyholder. The correct answer is B. Recommend enhanced roof bracing, providing clear, actionable guidance on the types of bracing that meet industry standards and regulatory expectations for wind resistance, and explaining how this measure contributes to overall risk reduction and potential long-term policy benefits. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an insurance specialist to balance the insurer's financial interest with the policyholder's need for effective loss prevention advice, all while adhering to regulatory mandates. The specialist must interpret and apply the principles of loss prevention and control as outlined in the relevant regulatory framework, ensuring that recommendations are both practical for the homeowner and aligned with the insurer's underwriting and risk management objectives. The challenge lies in providing actionable advice that demonstrably reduces risk without imposing undue financial or practical burdens on the policyholder, thereby maintaining customer satisfaction and compliance. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the specific loss prevention requirement mandated by the homeowner's insurance specialist regulatory jurisdiction. This approach prioritizes implementing measures that are demonstrably effective in mitigating identified risks, as supported by industry, best practices, and regulatory guidance. The specialist must ensure that any recommended loss prevention measures are clearly communicated to the policyholder, explaining their rationale and potential benefits in terms of reduced risk and, where applicable, potential premium adjustments. This aligns with the regulatory duty of care to provide accurate and helpful information, promoting responsible risk management by policyholders and fulfilling the insurer's obligation to underwrite sound risks. Adherence to these principles ensures compliance with regulations that often require insurers to promote loss control and risk mitigation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction for the insurer, without adequate consideration for the policyholder's ability to implement the measures or their actual effectiveness, fails to meet regulatory expectations. Such an approach could be seen as prioritizing profit over policyholder well-being and risk reduction, potentially violating principles of fair dealing and responsible insurance practices. Another incorrect approach that involves recommending loss prevention measures that are overly complex, expensive, or impractical for the average homeowner to implement would also be professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the policyholder's circumstances and could lead to non-compliance with recommendations, rendering them ineffective and potentially creating a false sense of security. This undermines the purpose of loss prevention and could expose the insurer to greater claims in the future, while also failing to uphold the duty to provide useful and actionable advice. A further incorrect approach that neglects to document the loss prevention advice provided and the policyholder's response would be a failure in record keeping and accountability, which are often stipulated by regulatory bodies. Proper documentation is crucial for demonstrating compliance, managing future claims, and providing a clear audit trail of risk management efforts. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of identified risks, followed by a review of available loss prevention strategies. The specialist must then assess these strategies against regulatory requirements, industry best practices, and the practical capabilities of the policyholder. Clear communication, documentation, and a commitment to fostering a partnership with the policyholder in risk management are paramount to achieving both compliance and effective loss control. Question 11. The control framework reveals that a homeowner's insurance policyholder has recently stored a significant quantity of untreated lumber and several containers of gasoline on their property, awaiting a planned renovation. The insurance specialist is tasked with evaluating the implications of these materials on the existing policy. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the specialist to take? Option A. Assume the materials are temporary and pose no immediate threat, continuing to service the policy without further investigation or communication with the policyholder. Option B. Accept the policyholder's verbal assurance that the materials will be removed promptly and take no further action regarding the policy's terms. Option C. Review the policy's materials on site clause and relevant underwriting guidelines to assess the impact on risk and determine if policy adjustments or endorsements are necessary, consulting with underwriting if ambiguity exists. Option D. Immediately issue a notice of cancellation for the policy due to the increased hazard presented by the stored materials. The correct answer is C. Review the policy's materials on site clause and relevant underwriting guidelines to assess the impact on risk and determine if policy adjustments or endorsements are necessary, consulting with underwriting if ambiguity exists. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an insurance specialist to balance the insurer's need to manage risk with the policyholder's expectation of fair treatment and accurate coverage. The presence of materials on site, particularly those that are flammable or pose a structural risk, directly impacts the insurability and premium calculation for a homeowner's policy. A specialist must interpret policy language, assess risk accurately, and communicate effectively with the policyholder, all while adhering to regulatory requirements. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the policy's materials on site clause and any related endorsements or exclusions. This includes understanding how the presence of specific materials, e.g., excess lumber, stored fuels, roofing materials awaiting installation, affects the risk profile. The specialist should then consult internal underwriting guidelines and relevant state regulations to determine if the current situation constitutes a material misrepresentation, a change in risk, or a condition that requires specific policy adjustments or endorsements. If the policy language is ambiguous or the situation presents a novel risk, seeking clarification from underwriting or legal counsel is a prudent step. This approach ensures compliance with policy terms, accurate risk assessment, and fair treatment of the policyholder, aligning with the principles of good faith and fair dealing mandated by insurance regulations. An incorrect approach would be to ignore the presence of materials on site, assuming they are temporary and pose no immediate threat. This failure to investigate and assess a known risk can lead to underpricing the policy, inadequate reserves for potential claims, and a breach of the duty to accurately underwrite the risk. It also violates the principle of utmost good faith, as the insurer is not fully aware of the conditions on which the policy is being issued. Another incorrect approach is to immediately cancel the policy or impose an exorbitant premium increase without a clear basis in the policy contract or underwriting guidelines. This could be seen as an unfair claims settlement practice or discriminatory pricing, depending on the specific regulations governing such actions. The insurer has a responsibility to assess risk and adjust premiums or coverage accordingly, but this must be done through a defined, transparent, and regulated process. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on the policyholder's verbal assurances about the materials without any independent verification or documentation. While policyholders are expected to provide accurate information, the insurer also has a responsibility to conduct due diligence, especially when potential hazards are apparent. This reliance on unverified information can lead to coverage disputes and claims denials, undermining the insurer's credibility and potentially violating regulatory requirements for proper risk assessment. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making process. First, identify the relevant policy provisions and regulatory requirements. Second, gather all pertinent facts regarding the materials on site. Third, assess the risk presented by these materials in accordance with underwriting guidelines and regulatory standards. Fourth, determine the appropriate course of action, which may include requesting additional information, amending the policy, or, if necessary, non-renewal or cancellation in compliance with notice requirements. And fifth, document all findings, decisions, and communications thoroughly. Question 12. The review process indicates a policyholder is seeking a claim for damage caused by a sudden and accidental water discharge from a pipe within an interior wall. The policy in question is a standard homeowners policy. Which of the following best describes the likely coverage outcome based on typical policy limitations for this type of event? Option A. Coverage is unlikely to be provided because damage from interior plumbing is generally excluded in standard homeowners policies. Option B. Coverage is likely to be denied because the water discharge originated within a wall, which is considered an uninsurable location. Option C. Coverage is likely to be provided regardless of the cause, as homeowners' policies are designed to cover all types of water damage. Option D. Coverage is likely to be provided, as the policy typically covers sudden and accidental water damage from interior plumbing, subject to the policy's deductible and any specific exclusions for gradual leaks or mold. The correct answer is D. Coverage is likely to be provided, as the policy typically covers sudden and accidental water damage from interior plumbing, subject to the policy's deductible and any specific exclusions for gradual leaks or mold. Explanation. The review process indicates a potential gap in understanding coverage limitations for homeowners' insurance policies, specifically concerning the distinction between named perils and open perils coverage. This scenario is professionally challenging because misinterpreting these limitations can lead to significant financial consequences for both the policyholder and the insurer, potentially resulting in denied claims and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to accurately assess the scope of coverage based on the policy wording and applicable regulations. The correct approach involves accurately identifying whether the loss is caused by a peril specifically listed in a named perils policy, or if it falls under the broader coverage of an open perils policy, considering any exclusions. This aligns with the regulatory framework that mandates clear and accurate communication of policy terms and conditions to consumers. Insurers have a duty to provide coverage as described in the policy, and policyholders have a right to understand what is covered and what is not. Adhering to the policy's specific peril definitions and exclusions is paramount to fulfilling contractual obligations and regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach would be to assume coverage for a loss simply because it is a common homeowner issue, without verifying if the specific peril causing the damage is listed in a named perils policy or if it is excluded from an open perils policy. This fails to uphold the principle of accurate representation of policy terms and can lead to unfair claim denials, violating consumer protection regulations. Another incorrect approach is to interpret policy language in a way that is overly broad or ambiguous, favoring the policyholder without a clear basis in the policy contract or regulatory guidance. This can expose the insurer to unintended risks and financial losses, potentially leading to regulatory scrutiny for inadequate underwriting or claims handling practices. A third incorrect approach is to rely on general industry knowledge or past claim experiences rather than the specific policy wording and its defined limitations. This disregards the contractual nature of insurance and the importance of adhering to the precise terms agreed upon by the insurer and the policyholder, which is a fundamental regulatory expectation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a thorough review of the policy contract, including all endorsements and exclusions, in conjunction with the specific circumstances of the loss. This involves cross-referencing the cause of loss with the defined perils and exclusions to determine coverage. When in doubt, consulting with underwriting or legal counsel is advisable to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements and ethical obligations to both the policyholder and the insurer. Question 13. The risk matrix shows a homeowner's insurance policyholder whose primary residence sustained significant damage from a covered peril, rendering it uninhabitable. The insured has secured temporary accommodation in a rental property. The insured also owns a second home in a different state, which they occasionally visit but is not their primary residence. The insured is requesting reimbursement for the full rental cost of the temporary accommodation, as well as their ongoing mortgage payments for the damaged primary residence and the property taxes for the second home, arguing these are all necessary expenses due to the loss of use, which approach best aligns with the principles of Coverage D loss of use under standard homeowners insurance regulations. Option A. Reimburse the insured for the necessary and reasonable rental costs of the temporary accommodation that are in excess of what they would have normally spent on housing, while denying coverage for the mortgage payments on the damaged home and the property taxes on the second home. Option B. Reimburse the insured for the full rental cost of the temporary accommodation and the ongoing mortgage payments for the damaged primary residence, but deny coverage for the property taxes on the second home. Option C. Deny coverage for the rental accommodation, stating the insured has a second home they can utilize, and also deny coverage for the mortgage payments and property taxes. Option D. Reimburse the insured for the full rental cost of the temporary accommodation, the ongoing mortgage payments for the damaged primary residence, and the property taxes for the second home, as all are expenses incurred during the period of displacement. The correct answer is A. Reimburse the insured for the necessary and reasonable rental costs of the temporary accommodation that are in excess of what they would have normally spent on housing, while denying coverage for the mortgage payments on the damaged home and the property taxes on the second home. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires the homeowner's insurance specialist to interpret and apply Coverage D loss of use in a situation where the insured's primary residence is uninhabitable due to a covered peril, but they have alternative housing arrangements that are not directly related to the loss itself. The specialist must distinguish between expenses directly necessitated by the displacement and those that are part of the insured's normal living costs, even if those costs are now being incurred elsewhere. This requires careful consideration of the policy's intent and the specific wording of Coverage D, as well as an understanding of what constitutes a necessary and reasonable expense. The correct approach involves accurately assessing the additional living expenses incurred by the insured due to the loss of use of their home. This means identifying costs that the insured would not have incurred had the loss not occurred. For example, if the insured rents a temporary dwelling that is comparable in size and amenities to their damaged home, the rent for that dwelling would be a covered expense. Similarly, increased utility costs directly attributable to the temporary dwelling, or the cost of meals purchased outside the home if the temporary dwelling lacks cooking facilities, would be considered. This approach aligns with the purpose of Coverage D, which is to restore the insured to their pre-loss standard of living by covering expenses incurred because they cannot occupy their damaged home. Regulatory frameworks for homeowners insurance typically define additional living expenses in a way that supports this interpretation, focusing on the incremental costs of maintaining a comparable standard of living. An incorrect approach would be to reimburse the insured for the full cost of their temporary housing without considering whether those costs are truly additional. For instance, if the insured chooses to rent a significantly more luxurious or larger property than their damaged home, the excess cost above what would be considered comparable would not be covered. Similarly, covering expenses that the insured would have incurred regardless of the loss, such as the mortgage payment on their damaged home, unless specifically addressed by another policy provision or endorsement, or the cost of maintaining a vacation home they would have used anyway, would be a misapplication of Coverage D. This fails to adhere to the principle of indemnification, which aims to put the insured back in the financial position they were in before the loss, not to provide a windfall. Another incorrect approach would be to deny coverage for any temporary housing costs simply because the insured has other properties they could use. While the insured may have alternative properties, Coverage D is intended to cover the necessary and reasonable expenses incurred to maintain a comparable standard of living while their primary residence is uninhabitable if the alternative properties are not suitable for their immediate needs or would result in a significantly lower standard of living. The costs associated with suitable temporary housing should be considered. This approach ignores the spirit and intent of the coverage. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough review of the specific policy language for Coverage D, including any definitions of additional living expenses or fair rental value. The specialist should then gather all relevant documentation from the insured regarding their temporary housing arrangements and associated expenses. A comparative analysis should be performed to determine which expenses are directly attributable to the loss of use and represent an increase over the insured's normal living expenses. Consulting with underwriting or claims management for clarification on ambiguous policy provisions or complex situations is also a crucial step in ensuring accurate and compliant claim handling. Question 14. Assessment of a homeowner's potential liability under Coverage E personal liability following an incident where their guest tripped over an unsecured rug in the home and sustained a minor injury requires the insurance specialist to consider which of the following primary factors. Option A. The specific definitions and exclusions within the homeowner's policy related to bodily injury and premises liability, as well as any applicable state insurance regulations. Option B. Whether the homeowner has previously filed claims for similar incidents. Option C. The homeowner's emotional distress regarding the guest's injury and the guest's immediate forgiveness. Option D. The guest's perceived financial need for compensation. The correct answer is C. The homeowner's emotional distress regarding the guest's injury and the guest's immediate forgiveness. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an insurance specialist to accurately assess potential liability exposures arising from a homeowner's actions, distinguishing between covered and excluded events under Coverage E personal liability. The specialist must apply the policy's terms and conditions to a real-world situation, considering the nuances of negligence and foreseeability, without overstepping into legal advice. This demands a thorough understanding of the policy contract and relevant regulatory guidance on claims handling and policy interpretation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the homeowner's policy, specifically the definitions and exclusions related to Coverage E personal liability. This approach prioritizes understanding the policy contract as written and interpreting it in accordance with applicable state insurance regulations. It requires the specialist to determine if the described incident falls within the scope of bodily injury or property damage, as defined by the policy, and if any exclusions, such as intentional acts or business pursuits, apply. This aligns with the regulatory duty to interpret policy provisions fairly and accurately, ensuring that coverage is provided where it is contractually obligated and denied only where exclusions are clearly applicable and legally sound. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately assume coverage based on the homeowner's distress. This fails to adhere to the contractual obligations of the policy and the regulatory requirement for a thorough investigation. It risks providing coverage for events that are explicitly excluded, leading to potential financial losses for the insurer and misrepresentation of policy terms. Another incorrect approach is to advise the homeowner on their legal liability or suggest they settle the claim directly. This constitutes the unauthorized practice of law, a serious regulatory violation. Insurance specialists are licensed to interpret and administer insurance policies, not to provide legal counsel. This can expose both the specialist and the insurer to significant legal and regulatory penalties. A further incorrect approach is to deny coverage solely because the incident was accidental and involved a guest. While accidental incidents are generally covered, this approach overlooks the possibility of negligence and the specific wording of exclusions. A blanket denial without a detailed policy review and consideration of the circumstances is a failure to conduct a proper risk assessment and can lead to regulatory scrutiny for unfair claims practices. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such situations by first gathering all relevant facts about the incident. Next, they must consult the specific homeowner's insurance policy, paying close attention to the wording of Coverage E personal liability, including definitions of covered events and any applicable exclusions. The specialist should then cross-reference these policy provisions with state-specific insurance regulations, governing claims handling and policy interpretation. The decision on coverage should be based solely on this objective analysis of the policy contract and regulatory requirements, avoiding any personal opinions or legal pronouncements. Question 15. Upon reviewing a homeowner's insurance claim, an insured reports damage to a detached workshop located on their property. This workshop is a standalone building, approximately 50 feet from the main dwelling, and is primarily used by the insured for woodworking as a hobby. The workshop has electricity and plumbing, and its roof is partially attached to a fence that encloses a portion of the backyard. The insured believes this structure should be covered under Coverage B Other Structures. What is the most appropriate determination regarding coverage for the workshop? Option A. Coverage B Other Structures applies only if the workshop is used for storage of personal property and not for any active use like woodworking. Option B. Coverage B Other Structures likely applies, as the workshop is a detached structure on the insured premises used for a non-business purpose, despite the partial attachment to a fence. Option C. Coverage B Other Structures does not apply because the workshop has electricity and plumbing, which are features typically found in the main dwelling. Option D. Coverage B Other Structures does not apply because the workshop is partially attached to a fence, making it an extension of the main dwelling's perimeter. The correct answer is B. Coverage B Other Structures likely applies, as the workshop is a detached structure on the insured premises used for a non-business purpose, despite the partial attachment to a fence. Explanation: this scenario presents a common challenge in homeowners insurance where the application of Coverage B Other Structures requires a nuanced understanding of its purpose and limitations, particularly when dealing with structures that might have a dual purpose or are closely integrated with the main dwelling. The professional challenge lies in accurately interpreting the policy language and applying it to the specific facts of the insured's property, ensuring fair coverage without overextending the insurer's liability beyond the policy's intent. Misinterpreting Coverage B can lead to either underpayment of claims, causing customer dissatisfaction and potential regulatory scrutiny, or overpayment, impacting profitability and potentially leading to adverse selection. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the policy's definition of other structures and any exclusions or limitations that might apply. Specifically, it requires determining if the structure in question is truly separate and distinct from the main dwelling, and if its primary use aligns with the intent of Coverage B, which is typically for structures on the insured premises but not attached to the dwelling. This approach upholds the principle of accurate risk assessment and contract interpretation, aligning with regulatory requirements for fair claims handling and adherence to policy terms. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny coverage for any structure that has a functional connection to the main dwelling, even if it is physically separate. This fails to consider that Coverage B is intended for a range of detached structures, and a functional connection does not automatically disqualify it. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that any structure on the property, regardless of its nature or relationship to the dwelling, is covered under Coverage B. This overlooks the specific definitions and limitations within the policy and could lead to covering items not intended by the coverage, such as business-related outbuildings or structures not located on the insured premises. A further incorrect approach would be to apply a broad interpretation of other structures to include items that are clearly part of the main dwelling, such as an attached garage or a sunroom that is integral to the house's structure. This misinterprets the fundamental distinction between the dwelling and detached structures. Professionals should approach such situations by first meticulously examining the policy wording for Coverage B, paying close attention to definitions, exclusions, and any endorsements. They should then gather all relevant facts about the structure in question, including its construction, location, and primary use. Finally, they should apply the policy terms to the facts, seeking clarification from underwriting or legal counsel if the interpretation is ambiguous, to ensure a fair and compliant outcome. Question 16. Market research demonstrates that clients increasingly seek to insure high-value personal items beyond standard homeowners policy limits. A client approaches you, a homeowner's insurance specialist, wanting to insure a collection of antique firearms, a rare stamp collection, and several pieces of fine art. They have provided a general estimate of the total value of these items. What is the most appropriate course of action to ensure adequate and compliant coverage under a scheduled personal property endorsement? Option A. Explain to the client that while the scheduled personal property endorsement can be used, each category of item, firearms, stamps, art, will likely require individual listing with verified appraisals or detailed receipts to establish accurate coverage limits and ensure compliance with underwriting guidelines. Option B. Inform the client that standard homeowners policies are not designed for such high-value collections and recommend they seek specialized insurance policies for each category of item, without exploring the scheduled personal property endorsement further. Option C. Suggest the client simply increase the overall contents coverage limit on their homeowner's policy to accommodate the estimated value of these items, as this is a more straightforward approach. Option D. Advise the client that the scheduled personal property endorsement can cover all these items based on their estimated total value, and proceed to add a lump sum coverage amount to the policy. The correct answer is D. Advise the client that the scheduled personal property endorsement can cover all these items based on their estimated total value, and proceed to add a lump sum coverage amount to the policy. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the homeowner's insurance specialist to balance the client's desire for comprehensive coverage with the insurer's underwriting guidelines and the specific requirements of a scheduled personal property endorsement. The specialist must accurately assess the value and nature of the items to be scheduled, understand the limitations of the endorsement, and communicate these clearly to the client. Failure to do so can lead to underinsurance, policy disputes, and regulatory noncompliance. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the client's specific items, verifying their value through appraisals or receipts, and ensuring these items meet the criteria for scheduled property. This includes understanding the types of items typically covered, e.g., jewelry, art, collectibles, and any exclusions. The specialist must then accurately document these items on the endorsement, ensuring the coverage limits are appropriate and the policy reflects the true value of the scheduled property. This aligns with the regulatory duty to provide accurate and adequate insurance coverage, preventing misrepresentation and ensuring policyholders are not misled about their protection. It also upholds ethical obligations to act in the client's best interest by securing appropriate coverage. An incorrect approach would be to simply accept the client's stated values without verification. This fails to meet the insurer's underwriting requirements and can lead to the policy being issued with inaccurate information. If a claim arises, the insurer may deny coverage or pay out less than expected due to the discrepancy between the scheduled value and the actual value, potentially violating regulations related to fair claims handling and accurate policy issuance. Another incorrect approach would be to advise the client that the scheduled personal property endorsement covers all valuable items without qualification. This is a misrepresentation of the endorsement's scope and limitations. Many endorsements have specific categories of items they cover and may exclude others. Failing to clarify these limitations can lead to the client believing they have coverage for items that are not actually insured, resulting in a regulatory violation for providing misleading information and an ethical breach of fiduciary duty. A third incorrect approach would be to recommend a blanket high coverage limit for scheduled property without understanding the specific items the client wishes to schedule. This could lead to the client paying for coverage they do not need or, conversely, not scheduling specific high-value items that would require individual listing and potentially different underwriting. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to tailor the coverage to the client's specific needs and the nature of their property, potentially violating regulations requiring policies to be suitable for the insured circumstances. The professional decision-making process should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the client's needs and the specific items they wish to insure. 2. Gather necessary documentation, appraisal, receipts to verify the value and nature of the items. 3. Consult the insurer's underwriting guidelines and the specific policy language for the scheduled personal property endorsement. 4. Clearly explain the coverage, limitations, exclusions, and any specific requirements, like appraisals, to the client. 5. Accurately complete the endorsement with verified information and appropriate coverage limits. 6. Document all communication and decisions made during the process. Question 17. Performance analysis shows that a homeowner client who is hosting a small, informal gathering at their residence inquires about the medical payments coverage on their policy, expressing concern about potential minor injuries to guests. The client asks, "If someone trips and scrapes their knee or sprains an ankle at my party, will this coverage handle all their medical bills, no matter what?" What is the most appropriate response for the homeowner's insurance specialist to provide? Option A. Assure the client that medical payments coverage is a comprehensive safety net for any medical expenses incurred by guests on their property, and the policy limit is quite high. Option B. State that medical payments coverage has a specific limit, and the client should refer to their policy declarations page for the exact amount. Without further elaboration on its purpose, Option C. Explain that medical payments coverage is designed to pay for reasonable medical expenses for guests injured on the insured's property, regardless of fault, up to the policy limit, but it does not cover the insured's own injuries or injuries arising from business pursuits. Option D. Advise the client that medical payments coverage is primarily for situations where the insured is legally liable for the injury, and they should consult an attorney if any guest incurs medical expenses. The correct answer is C. Explain that medical payments coverage is designed to pay for reasonable medical expenses for guests injured on the insured's property, regardless of fault, up to the policy limit, but it does not cover the insured's own injuries or injuries arising from business pursuits. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the insurer's obligation to provide accurate information with the insured's potential misunderstanding and the agent's duty of care. The agent must navigate the complexities of medical payments coverage, which is designed to cover reasonable medical expenses incurred by others injured on the insured's property, regardless of fault. The challenge lies in ensuring the insured fully comprehends the scope and limitations of this coverage, without misrepresenting its benefits or creating unrealistic expectations. The correct approach involves clearly and accurately explaining the purpose and limitations of medical payments coverage to the insured. This includes emphasizing that it is intended for minor injuries and has a specific limit, and that it does not cover the insured's own injuries or injuries arising from business activities. This approach aligns with regulatory requirements for fair and accurate representation of policy terms and conditions, as well as ethical obligations to act in the best interest of the client by providing them with the information necessary to make informed decisions about their insurance needs. An incorrect approach that suggests the coverage is a broad catch-all for any medical bills incurred on the property would be a failure to accurately represent the policy. This misrepresentation could lead the insured to believe they have protection that does not exist, potentially resulting in financial hardship and a breach of regulatory guidelines concerning deceptive practices. Another incorrect approach, which is to simply state the coverage limit without explaining its purpose or applicability, fails to adequately inform the insured and could lead to misunderstandings about when the coverage would actually respond. This lack of clarity can be seen as a failure in the agent's duty to ensure the insured understands their policy. Professionals should approach such situations by prioritizing clear, honest, and comprehensive communication. This involves understanding the policy thoroughly, anticipating potential client questions or misunderstandings, and explaining coverage in plain language. When in doubt, it is always best to err on the side of providing more detail and clarification rather than less, ensuring the client has a realistic understanding of their insurance protection. Question 18. Implementation of a clear explanation of coverage F medical payments to others for a policyholder who recently had a neighbor sustain a minor injury while visiting their home, focusing on the coverage purpose and limitations. Option A. Suggest to the policyholder that coverage F is a form of health insurance for their visitors and will cover any ongoing medical treatment the neighbor may require. Option B. Explain that coverage F is a no-fault coverage designed to pay for reasonable medical expenses incurred by a guest injured on the insured premises, up to the policy limit, and that it is separate from liability coverage. Option C. Inform the policyholder that coverage F only applies if they are found legally liable for the neighbor's injury, and that they should wait for a determination of fault before considering this coverage. Option D. Advise the policyholder that coverage F will pay for all medical bills for their neighbor because they were a guest in the home, regardless of the policy's stated limits or whether the policyholder was at fault. Correct answer is B. Explain that coverage F is a no-fault coverage designed to pay for reasonable medical expenses incurred by a guest injured on the insured premises, up to the policy limit, and that it is separate from liability coverage. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a homeowner's insurance specialist by requiring them to advise a policyholder on the practical application and limitations of coverage F medical payments to others. The challenge lies in accurately explaining the coverage purpose, its scope, and its distinction from liability coverage, ensuring the policyholder understands when it applies and when it does not, thereby managing expectations and preventing potential disputes. The specialist must navigate the nuances of the policy wording and relevant regulations to provide clear, actionable advice. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves clearly explaining to the policyholder that coverage F is designed to pay for reasonable medical expenses incurred by someone injured on the insured premises, regardless of fault. This includes clarifying that it is a goodwill gesture and is typically limited to smaller, immediate medical costs, such as emergency room visits or ambulance fees, up to the policy limit. The specialist must emphasize that this coverage is distinct from coverage L personal liability, which would apply if the policyholder were legally liable for the injury. This approach is correct because it accurately reflects the intent and function of coverage F as outlined in standard homeowners insurance policies and aligns with regulatory guidance that promotes clear communication of policy terms and conditions to policyholders. It empowers the policyholder with accurate information, enabling them to make informed decisions about their insurance and understand the scope of their protection. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that suggests coverage F will cover all medical expenses for any guest, regardless of the circumstances or the severity of the injury, is incorrect. This fails to acknowledge the policy limits and the distinction between medical payments and liability coverage. It misrepresents the coverage purpose and could lead to the policyholder believing they have broader protection than they actually do, creating a false sense of security and potentially leading to financial disappointment. Another incorrect approach would be to state that coverage F only applies if the insured homeowner is proven to be negligent. This is fundamentally wrong, as a key feature of coverage F is its no-fault nature. It is intended to cover medical expenses irrespective of whether the policyholder was at fault, thereby fostering good neighborly relations and avoiding potentially costly disputes over minor incidents. Misrepresenting this aspect undermines the core benefit of the coverage. Finally, advising the policyholder that coverage F is a substitute for health insurance is also incorrect. While it covers medical payments for others, it is not designed to be comprehensive health coverage for individuals. Its limits are typically low, and it is intended for specific short-term medical needs arising from an incident on the insured property, not for ongoing medical treatment or pre-existing conditions. This mischaracterization could lead to a severe gap in the policyholder's understanding of their overall insurance needs. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach such inquiries by first identifying the specific coverage in question and its intended purpose within the homeowner's policy framework. They should then consult the policy contract and any relevant jurisdictional regulations or guidelines to ensure their explanation is accurate and compliant. The next step is to communicate this information to the policyholder in clear, understandable language, avoiding jargon and focusing on practical application. It is crucial to differentiate between various coverages, e.g., medical payments vs. liability, and to manage policyholder expectations by clearly stating limitations and exclusions. This systematic approach ensures accurate advice, fosters trust, and upholds professional standards. Question 19. Which approach would be most appropriate for a homeowner's insurance specialist to take when presented with a claim for medical payments arising from an incident where the injured party was allegedly trespassing on the insured's property and was injured while attempting to steal a garden gnome? Option A. Advise the policyholder that medical payments coverage typically applies to injuries sustained by guests or visitors on the property, regardless of the circumstances, and proceed with processing the claim for payment. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the policy's medical payments exclusion clause, specifically examining any provisions related to intentional acts, criminal activity, or injuries sustained by individuals not invited onto the premises, and compare these to the reported facts of the incident. Option C. Immediately deny the claim based on the injured party's status as a trespasser and their alleged criminal intent, without a detailed review of the specific medical payments exclusion clause in the policy. Option D. Recommend that the policyholder pay the injured party directly for their medical expenses to avoid any potential disputes with the insurance company. The correct answer is A. Advise the policyholder that medical payments coverage typically applies to injuries sustained by guests or visitors on the property, regardless of the circumstances, and proceed with processing the claim for payment. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the specialist to navigate the nuances of a policy exclusion, specifically concerning medical payments, while adhering strictly to the defined regulatory framework for homeowners insurance specialists. The core difficulty lies in accurately interpreting the policy language and applying it to a factual situation that may appear ambiguous at first glance. A thorough understanding of the policy's intent and the regulatory intent behind such exclusions is paramount to avoid misrepresentation or improper claim denial. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the policy's medical payments exclusion clause and comparing it against the specific circumstances of the incident. This approach is right because it directly addresses the policy terms and conditions as mandated by regulatory oversight. Specifically, the homeowner's insurance specialist must determine if the injured party's actions or the nature of the injury fall within the explicit boundaries of the exclusion, such as intentional acts or participation in a criminal enterprise, as defined by the policy and interpreted through relevant state insurance regulations. This ensures that coverage is applied or denied based on the contractual agreement and legal requirements, upholding principles of fairness and compliance. An incorrect approach would be to assume coverage based on a general understanding of medical payments coverage without scrutinizing the specific exclusion. This fails to acknowledge the contractual limitations agreed upon by the policyholder and the insurer, potentially leading to an improper payment of a claim that should be excluded. Another incorrect approach would be to deny coverage solely based on the insurer's desire to limit payouts, without a clear and justifiable basis within the policy's exclusion language and supporting regulations. This could constitute bad faith and violate consumer protection laws. A further incorrect approach would be to interpret the exclusion in a manner that is overly broad or inconsistent with common industry practice and regulatory guidance, thereby unfairly burdening the policyholder. Professional decision-making in similar situations requires a systematic process. First, thoroughly understand the policy provisions, particularly any exclusion clauses. Second, gather all relevant facts pertaining to the incident. Third, cross-reference the facts with the policy language and applicable state insurance laws and regulations. Fourth, consult with underwriting or legal counsel if ambiguity persists. Finally, communicate the decision clearly and transparently to the policyholder, citing the specific policy provisions and regulatory basis for the determination. Question 20. The analysis reveals that a homeowner insured under a policy with a worldwide coverage endorsement is inquiring about the extent of protection for personal property temporarily located in a different country. Which of the following approaches best addresses this inquiry within the regulatory framework for homeowners insurance? Option A. State that such inquiries require a separate specialized policy for international coverage. Option B. Inform the policyholder that worldwide coverage is a standard feature and they should assume their property is fully protected abroad. Option C. Advise the policyholder that worldwide coverage generally means all personal property is covered regardless of location. Option D. Review the specific policy wording, including any endorsements, to identify any geographical limitations, sublimits, or exclusions that apply to property outside the primary residence country. The correct answer is D. Review the specific policy wording, including any endorsements, to identify any geographical limitations, sublimits, or exclusions that apply to property outside the primary residence country. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because homeowners insurance policies, particularly those offering worldwide coverage, often have nuanced limitations and exclusions that can be easily misunderstood by policyholders. The complexity arises from the need to balance providing comprehensive coverage with the insurer's risk management and the policyholder's reasonable expectations. Careful judgment is required to accurately interpret policy language and advise clients appropriately, ensuring they understand the scope and limitations of their coverage. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the policy's worldwide coverage provisions, specifically identifying any geographical limitations, sublimits for certain perils or locations, or specific exclusions that might apply to property located outside the primary residence country. This approach is professionally sound because it directly addresses the policyholder's inquiry by examining the specific terms and conditions of their contract. Regulatory frameworks for insurance, such as those governing fair claims handling and consumer protection, mandate that insurers provide clear and accurate information about policy coverage. Ethically, this approach upholds the principle of transparency and ensures the policyholder is not misled about the extent of their protection. An incorrect approach would be to assume that worldwide coverage automatically means unlimited protection everywhere. This is a regulatory failure because it deviates from the principle of providing accurate policy information and could lead to a misrepresentation of coverage. Ethically, it breaches the duty of care owed to the policyholder by failing to disclose critical limitations. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on general industry knowledge or past experience with similar policies without consulting the specific policy wording. This is a regulatory failure as it bypasses the contractual obligations outlined in the policy document, which is the definitive source of coverage. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of diligence and could result in the policyholder being underinsured, leading to potential financial hardship. A further incorrect approach would be to provide a generic answer without investigating the specific details of the policy's worldwide coverage. This is a regulatory failure because it fails to meet the obligation to provide specific and accurate information relevant to the policyholder's circumstances. Ethically, it is a dereliction of professional duty, as it does not adequately inform the policyholder about their coverage. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of the policy document, focusing on the specific clauses related to the inquiry. This includes cross-referencing with any endorsements or riders that may modify standard coverage. If ambiguity exists, consulting with underwriting or legal departments for clarification is essential. The ultimate goal is to provide the policyholder with a clear, accurate, and contractually supported explanation of their coverage.